Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel, guys, with your favorite YouTuber, Mono the Entertainment King, where today we're going through another AP World History AMSCO reading, where today we're reading Chapter 4.5, Maritime Empires Develop. Now, without further ado, let's get into the chapter. Quote, all of the residents of these United Provinces, the Netherlands, shall be allowed to participate in the Dutch East India Company, and to do so with as little or as great an amount of money as they choose. End quote. From the Charter Dutch East India Company during 1602. Essential question. What economic strategies did maritime empires use to increase their power, and how did the developing empires affect political, economic, religious, and cultural dynamics? Maritime, sea-based empires transform commerce from local, small-scale trading, mostly based on barter, to large-scale international trade using gold and silver. These empires employed a new economic model, or numerous models, such as joint stock companies, through which investors finance trade by buying shares in corporations such as the East India Company, supporting increased trade in Asia. New ocean trade routes were opened, aiding the rise of this extended global economy. The Atlantic trading system involved the movement of labor, including slaves, and the mixing of African, American, and European cultures and peoples, with all groups contributing to a cultural synthesis. Silver, sugar, and slavery were also keys to the developments of these mercantilist empires. Economic strategies. In the 17th century, Europeans generally measured the wealth of a country in how much gold and silver it had in its coffers. To achieve this wealth, countries used economic strategies designed to sell as many goods as they could to other countries in order to obtain maximum amounts of gold and silver. To keep their wealth, countries would also spend as little of their precious metals as possible on goods from other countries. The accumulation of capital, material wealth available to produce more wealth in Western Europe grew as entrepreneurs entered long-distance markets. Capital changed hands from entrepreneurs to laborers, putting laborers in a better position to become consumers, and even investors, as the above quote suggests. Despite restrictions by the church, lending money at high rates of interest became commonplace. Actual wealth also increased with gold and silver from the Western Hemisphere. Commercial Revolution. The transformation to a trade-based economy using gold and silver is known as the Commercial Revolution. The Commercial Revolution affected all regions of the world and resulted from four key factors: the development of European overseas colonies, the opening of new ocean trade routes, population growth, and inflation, caused partially by the pressure of the increasing population and partly by the increased amount of gold and silver that was mined and put into circulation. The high rate of inflation, or general rise in prices, in the 16th and early 17th century is called the Price Revolution. Aiding the rise of this extended global economy was the formation of joint stock companies, owned by investors who brought back or shares in them. People invested capital in such companies and shared both the profits and the risk of exploration and trading ventures. Offering limited liability, the principle that an investor was not responsible for a company's debts or other liabilities beyond the amount of an investment made investing safer. The developing European middle class had capital to invest from successful businesses in their home countries. They also had money with which to purchase imported luxuries. The Dutch, English, and French all developed joint stock companies in the 17th century, including the British East India Company in 1600 and the Dutch East India Company in 1602. In Spain and Portugal, however, the government did most of the investing itself through grants to certain explorers. Joint stock companies were a driving force behind the development of maritime empires, as they allowed continued exploration, as well as ventures to colonize and develop the resources of distant lands with limited risk to investors. Commerce and finance. The Dutch were long the commercial middlemen of Europe, having set up and maintained trade routes to Latin America, North America, and South America and Indonesia. Dutch ships were faster and lighter than those of their rivals for most of the 17th century, giving them an early trade advantage. The Dutch East India Company was also highly successful as a joint stock company. It made enormous profits in the Spice Islands and Southeast Asia. It is also shown on page 233 of your textbook with the image having a source from Wikimedia Commons and the description stating the Dutch ship Vryburg on Chinese ocean export porcelain 1756. Keep this source in mind as it could maybe potentially be helpful in showing how maritime empires were effective during the time period of 1450 to 1750. Pioneers in finance, the Dutch had a stock exchange as early as 1602. By 1609, the Bank of Amsterdam traded currency internationally. The Dutch standard of living was the highest in Europe, as such goods as diamonds, linen, pottery, and tulip bulbs passed through the hands of Dutch traders. France and England were not so fortunate. Early in the 18th century, both fell victim to speculative financial schemes, known as financial bubbles. These schemes were based on the sale of shares to investors who were promised a certain return on their investment. After a frenzy of buying that drove up the price of shares, the bubble burst and investors lost huge amounts of money, sending many into bankruptcy and inflicting wide damage to the economy. Triangular trade. The Europeans' desire for enslaved workers in the Americas, coupled with Portugal's discovery, quote-unquote, of West Africa, meant that Africa became the source of new labor. Enslaved Africans became part of a complex Atlantic trading system known as the triangular trade, because voyages often had three segments. A ship might carry European manufactured goods such as firearms to West Africa, and from there transport enslaved Africans to the Americas, then load up with sugar or tobacco to take to Europe. Sugar was the most profitable good from the Americas. By the 1700s, Caribbean sugar production and rum made from sugar were financing fortunes in Britain and to a lesser extent in France and the Netherlands. And as you can see here on this source on page 234 in the AP World History textbook, we actually can see a map of the triangular trade, demonstrating how it actually shows where everything would go. And also this map seems to mainly be focused around the coasts in the east coast of North America and also the west coast of Africa, Spain, Great Britain, and many European countries. Take a minute to look at this, and this is a very important source as this will definitely be involved on any AP World History test, and also be involved as a general part of history because 1450 to 1750 is one of the most important parts of our world as it helped our modern society. Rivalries for the Indian Ocean trade. After Europeans stumbled on the Americas, trade over the Atlantic Ocean became significant. However, states continued to vie for control of trade routes on the Indian Ocean as well. The Portuguese defeated a combined Muslim and Venetian force in a naval battle in the Arabian Sea in 1509. See topic 4.4 or a previous video in this playlist, over controlling trade. They met a different fate, though, when they tried to conquer Moroccan forces in a battle on land in 1578. Its coffers depleted after the victory, Morocco looked inland to capture the riches of the Songhai kingdom. Despite the prohibition of waging war on another Muslim state, with thousands of soldiers, camels, and horses, as well as 8 cannons and other firearms, Moroccan forces traveled months to reach Songhai. In 1590, in a battle near Gao, the Songhai, despite their greater number of fighters, were overcome by the force of firearms. The empire crumbled. The Spanish and Portuguese soon overtook much of this territory. Change and continuities in trade networks. The trading networks involved a new global circulation of goods, wealth, and labor. Silver from the Spanish colonies in the Americas flowed to Asia, where Asians were eager to exchange their goods, silks, porcelain, steel products, for silver. Asian goods were eagerly purchased in the Atlantic markets. New monopolies. One way these patterns of trade were maintained was through monopolies, chartered by European rulers. Monopolies granted certain merchants, usually through a joint stock company or the government itself, the exclusive right to trade. For example, the Spanish government established a monopoly first over all the domestic tobacco grown and then over all the tobacco grown in its American colonies. The profit from this monopoly greatly enriched the Spanish government. The income from tobacco in Spain made up about 1/3 of total revenues. Ongoing regional markets. At the same time, traditional regional markets continued to flourish in Afro-Eurasia. However, improved shipping offered merchants the opportunity to increase their volume of products. The increasing output of peasant and artisan labor, wool and linens from Western Europe, cotton from India, and silk from China exchanged hands in ports, cities with global connections. Effects of the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade greatly weakened several West African kingdoms, such as the Congo. The loss of so many people slowed population growth. Trade competition led to violence among their societies, but also made African slave-raiding kingdoms economically dependent on goods from Europe. Such societies were slow to develop more complex economies in which they were produced their own goods. Thus, the slave trade set the stage for European conquest and imperialism of the late 19th century, or see topic 6.2, a later video in a later playlist, which you should probably stay on for. Economically, African societies that conducted slave raids, such as the Dahomey and the Oyo, became richer from selling their captives to Europeans. This trade also had political effects, because when a society such as the Dahomey exchanged slaves for guns, its raiders easily took advantage of rival societies that had no firearms. Without firearms, neighboring groups could not fight off slave raids, so raiding societies became even richer and more fortified with firearms. Intergroup warfare thus became more common and bloodier as a result of the slave trade. Slavery and gender. Those most affected by the slave trade were the peoples and civilizations of West Africa and present-day Ghana and Benin, from which most Africans were kidnapped or sold. Gender distributions in those regions became severely imbalanced, because more than 2/3 of those taken were males. The resulting predominance of women prompted a rise in polygamy, the taking of more than one wife, and forced women to assume duties that had traditionally been men's jobs. Impact of new foods. While the Atlantic trading system weakened Africa in many ways, it also ultimately spurred population growth through an improved diet. The Columbian Exchange introduced new crops to the continent, such as American crops, maize, peanuts, and manioc, also known as yucca or cassava, which became staples in the African diet. Political and cultural changes for indigenous peoples. Earlier, land-based empires, such as those of the Romans, Muslims, and Mongols, all grappled with how to deal with conquered peoples' traditions and cultures. These empires either allowed traditions to exist, or they tried to graft their ways onto those of their own subjects. European empires in the Americas stood in stark contrast to these land-based empires. The Spanish and Portuguese empires managed to erase the basic social structures and many of the cultural traditions of the indigenous Americans within a century of when the first European explorers arrived. The Europeans' actions nearly depopulated the Americas. Political changes, colonial administration. Indigenous political structures in Latin America were soon replaced by Spanish and Portuguese colonial administrations. Spanish royalty appointed viceroys to act as administrators and representatives of the Spanish crown. To keep these viceroys from operating independently of the crown, Spain established audiencias, or royal courts, to which Spanish settlers could appeal viceroys' decisions or policies. Slow transportation and communication networks between Europe and the Americas, however, made it difficult for the Spanish crown to exercise direct control over New Spain. As a result, the Spanish throne did not focus on colonial affairs in the Western Hemisphere. Cultural changes. The indigenous peoples of the Americas lost a great deal of their culture and history at the hands of conquerors. Conquistadors, such as Cortes in Mexico, ordered the burning of native books, which were thought to be unholy. Thus, very few original accounts written in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, exist today. The scarcity of first-hand accounts from indigenous peoples has shaped how historians view this period. For example, because the Spanish burned nearly all Aztec accounts, most of the information about the Aztec come from documents that were written by Spanish conquistadors and priests after the conquest. The author's biases and lack of familiarity with Nahuatl limits the value of these sources. However, some sources are considered reliable. For example, in 1545, a Spanish priest named Bernardo de Sahaguan began compiling the Florentine Codex, one of the most widely cited sources about Aztec life before conquest. A codex is also a type of book, by the way, for those who don't know. Spanish and Portuguese conquerors transplanted their own languages and religion into the Americas. The remnants of this cultural interaction are present today. Although indigenous languages thrive in certain regions, in Guatemala and in the mountains of Mexico, for example, Spanish predominates through much of Latin America, and Brazilians overwhelmingly speak Portuguese. By 1750, those born in America or Spanish origin, or Creoles, enjoyed political dominance in New Spain. They soon began clamoring for independence from the Spanish throne. Effects of belief systems. The increase and intensity of newly established global connections between hemispheres extended the reach of existing religions. In some areas, the new connections contributed to the development of syncretic belief systems and practices. In other areas, the connections contributed to religious conflicts. Syncretic belief systems in the Americas. African religions in the Americas provide powerful examples of religious syncretism, or the combining of different religious beliefs and practices. Africans melded aspects of Christianity, usually Roman Catholicism, with their West African religious traditions, such as drumming, dancing, and a belief in spirits that could take over and act through a person, thus giving us Santeria, which means the way of the saints. Originally an African faith, it became popular in Cuba and then traveled throughout Latin America and to North America. Voodoo means spirit or deity. This belief system originated with African peoples of Dahomey, Congo, and Yoruba, who were enslaved and living in Saint Domingo, which is now Tahiti. Candomblé means dance to honor the gods. It is a combination of Yoruba, Fon, and Bantu beliefs from different parts of Africa. It developed in Brazil. Enslaved Africans in the United States also laid the roots for the African American Church, a hybrid of Christianity and African spiritual traditions that remains one of the oldest and most stable institutions in African American communities. Islam. About 1 in 10 of the enslaved Africans practiced Islam. While some of the men who sailed with Columbus may have been Muslims, these enslaved Africans began the first significant presence of Islam in the Americas. Religion in Latin America. Several Catholic religions, orders, and groups in Europe, such as Dominicans, Jesuits, and Franciscans, sent missionaries to Latin America to convert people to Christianity. The missionaries were so successful that today most Latin Americans are Roman Catholic Christians. In recent decades, Protestant denominations have begun to gain members. Numerous examples of religious syncretism organized in the Spanish colonies, Catholic Saints' Day that coincided with days honored by indigenous people, were especially celebrated. In Mexico, a cult developed around the dark complexion Virgin of Guadalupe, who was revered and revered for her ability to perform miracles. Global interactions and religious conflicts. Syncretic religions also developed in Afro-Eurasia as global interactions intensified. Sufism, for example, with its focus on personal salvation, helped spread Islam and have influenced Sikhism, which blended Muslim and Hindu belief systems. The Mughal leader, Akbar, see topic 3.2 or a previous video in our channel, tried to mediate conflicts between Muslims and Hindus under his control. Religion also played a role in conflicts as global interactions increased. The split between Sunni and Shia Muslims worsened conflicts between the Ottoman and Safavid empires. See topic 3.1 or a previous video on a previous playlist. The split between Catholicism and Protestantism, and between official state religions such as Angelicism and other Protestant sects, helped drive and the settlement of North America as people sought freedom to worship as they saw fit. Key terms by theme. Economy strategies. Capital. Commercial revolution. Price revolution. Joint stock companies. Limited liability. Dutch East India Company. Dutch East India Company. Triangle trade. Monopoly. Culture blending. Syncretism. Polygamy. Creoles. Santeria. Vodun. Candomblé. Virgin of Guadalupe. Government Latin America. Viceroys. Audiencias. Society slave trade. Dahomey. Oyo. And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's reading, and now to begin with a quick summary of some things that I think may be important, or at least some things that you should keep in mind if you want to try remembering some of the things we talked about in today's reading. So, first off, looking at the quote with today, all the residents of these United Provinces shall be allowed to participate in the company, to do so with as little or as great an amount of money as they choose. So, when looking at this quote, this is very important when considering and thinking about how during this time period, it definitely is sparking capital, monopoly, which if you have ever played the board game, ironically called Monopoly, you will definitely understand this. Because in this time period, we see the development of stocks, we see the rise of literal monopolies, people trying to develop business, and a definite shift, and somewhat of a shift away from violence and physical warfare to more arguments and contracts and arguments in courtrooms rather than bloody fistfights with swords and shields as we had seen previously in various wars. But also, aside from that, we also see this commercial revolution also again bringing another item to the table that we should really memorize. Because the commercial revolution, once again, affected all regions of the world and resulted from the key 4 factors, which was a development of overseas colonies, so colonialism, opening of new trade routes, so the development of maritime empires and maritime technologies, as well as an increase in population. Because more food, more trade is happening, therefore more food is being spread to different people. So like bananas, for example, bananas or peanuts, as previously stated, are very important to also helping increase the population. And also, newfound territories with newfound resources that we are needing or wanting. In other words, leading to the increase of gold and silver that was mined. Also, not to mention, stocks. If you've ever dabbled in stocks yourself, or for my more adult viewers out there, or if you've ever actually heard of stocks, then you kind of understand the basic point of what it would do. It's basically a way to help finance a company or organization or group or what have you in order to kind of help them develop whatever they're trying to do, like explorers. A lot of people, including the infamous Columbus himself, had to get a company or some people to finance him somehow. And stock companies, aside from being a way to not just finance that company, were also a way to get people to earn money, and also try to help lighten a little bit of the load of bankruptcy. Now, and also, as we can see here, triangle trade, this is definitely one of the most important parts of history right there in this chapter. Because triangle trade, again, the way it affected the world is still seen today. Because this helps the spread and the migration of cultures, peoples, biodiversity, what have you. So please, ladies and gentlemen, keep that in mind when you're studying up for your next AP World Test, or if you're trying to keep in mind that for a history conversation. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and please, if you did, hit the like button, subscribe, and also hit the notification bell to stay up to date and when I post more content. Sorry about any mispronunciations I may have had, but last time I checked, I'm not perfect, and no one ever is. So, if you enjoyed this video, please stay tuned for the next one coming up, which is Chapter 4.6. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, have a safe and happy day. Remember, stay safe, stay happy, and stay entertained.